Welcome to Managing Love Intelligently. I'm Jason.
And I'm Stephen Ng. And because Jason only gives his first name, you will know that he's the sidekick in this conversation. He actually does have a last name, and he's a very talented and educated man. And he is not just a sidekick. He is the brains behind the operation.
Oh, thanks. Well, Steve is the brains with the therapy knowledge, and I'm the brains with the other stuff knowledge. So how this usually works is I present Steve with the topic and we talk about it for an hour or so. But today we're going to do something a little bit different. About a week ago, we received a message via Psychology Today from a person calling themselves Alone. So today's episode is titled A Message from Alone. And before we kick off the conversation, if you have a question for Steve, visit stephening.com and fill out the contact form. At the end of each episode, Steve will answer a listener question, so stay tuned for that. Also, if you enjoy the podcast and find the information helpful, subscribe, share it with your friends, and give us a review if, something positive.
If you love us.
If you love us. Give us some love. It's all we're looking for. It's all anyone's looking for.
Well, it's all men are looking for anyway.
Yeah. So on April 18th of 2024, Steve published an article on Psychology Today titled How to Keep an Incel from Becoming a Sex Offender. And I'll let Steve kind of explain. That article, again, is on Steve's website and also on Psychology Today if you're interested in reading the whole thing. But Steve will give you a quick, brief summary about it.
Yeah, it's a relatively painless read. It's short and to the point. But basically, it's a plea for understanding in the therapy community and for the people who are friends and family of incels. And I think it's pretty informative. There's a couple links there that are going to be really helpful if you don't know much about this community. And all in all, it was designed as an attempt at a helpful gift to the entire community, both incels and those of us who are friends and family of incels.
Yeah. So that article is written, and about a week ago, we received a message from Psychology Today. And the message came in from the person calling themselves Alone, and I will just read that message to you now. So it goes this way. Stephen, I guess you're just Stephening. He put your last name and first name together to make a verb. I don't know, maybe a joke. So I guess you're just Stephening, whatever that is. But you ought to realize that there are a hell of a lot of incels and almost none are criminals. Your statement that incels risk becoming sex offenders shows your bigotry, and you ought to check it at the door thoroughly before you go anywhere near anyone who's alone. Why should incels go anywhere near a psychologist if they're only going to face bigots like you? That could be another traumatic experience for someone who has already suffered a lot.
Yeah. And without getting defensive, I wrote him back and just said I'd like to establish some sort of a dialogue and try to be more helpful. And I got a bounce back because he gave us a fake email.
Yes, the email was not real, so that bounced back. And it was one of those things where we just kind of said, well, we'll just let it go and there's nothing we could do. But a few days later, we got another message from Alone again. So this time was a little longer, and it read as follows. Stephen, since your hate-filled diatribe about people who haven't had sex in at least 6 months, and then in parentheses, the definition of incel, I've taken a look at your bio and your sites. I hope you will continue to look at yourself and your rants and understand that while you have met 3 or 4 incels who are dangerous, the vast majority are not. Your father was a married man with at least one result of his sperm distribution, and your bio says he was violent. If you aren't targeting married men with kids as a group based on that small sampling, you should know you shouldn't be going after men who are unfortunate enough not to have had sex in the past 6 months as a group either. If you don't, I suggest you accept my recommendation that you stop writing and undergo therapy for your hatred. Your words and views, when thrown into the sewer that is our public discourse, may have hurt a lot of men who are alone, who are good men. They certainly will be used to justify the hate-filled prejudices that incels face in our sewer of a society. There seem to be a lot of males who have already given up while still teens because of the hatred shown them for not fucking early and often. I would expect that they've already been taunted as incels, even at an age when they at least shouldn't be worried about not having sex yet. Your contribution to that sewer may have hurt some males for a lifetime. I hope you will think about and reconsider your words, not just to revise a column so it's barely out of the zone of gross irresponsibility, but to think about what you've spewed over the years and make real effort to make your own brain less of a sewer. Again, some poetry in here. Again, I will say that once I've seen the stereotypes in your head, I wouldn't want you or anyone with as much hatred as you have to counsel men who are alone. Men who are alone deserve better than a sewer like Stephen Ing.
Okay,
so kind of a lot there.
There's a lot to unpack, and I am looking forward to continuing the discussion. And I'd like to dedicate this episode of Managing Love Intelligently to Alone, because it was his writing that inspired us to do this particular show. He reminds me, I don't know if you've ever done this yourself, but if you've ever had a girlfriend, wife, partner, maybe even your mom, and you went out of your way to get a rather expensive and really what you thought was a really nice gift.
Yeah.
And then they open it, and by the look on their face, you can tell they're not feeling it. Mm. And, whether it was a vacuum cleaner or it was a mixer for the kitchen or whatever the heck it was, it's like it went over like a lead balloon. And that's kind of how I feel with Alone. But I'm hoping, ironically, that he's wrong about our listenership and my readership on Psychology Today, because I don't think that many people know about me. So I'd be surprised if I hurt very many people with some awkward turn of phrase or some bit of bad advice. But I would challenge not only Alone, but anybody else who at first blush might be feeling pretty defensive like he was feeling, to just identify what it is I might have said that was unhelpful. And I say that because if you've read any of my stuff at all, you'll note that I think a lot of us are at risk for sex crimes. And I've mentioned the religious, I've mentioned those who are unhappily married, I've mentioned people who rely on pornography. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of demographics there that are at risk. And mostly because sexual criminality is not the result of a moral decision, nor is it the result of sexual deviancy in terms of diagnosis, but it's really just a failure to intelligently manage our love lives in a way that gets our needs taken care of. And by needs, I don't mean just intercourse, but our needs for meaningful connection. So if we have a meaningful connection, I think we're far more likely to get our needs met, because our needs are far more than merely physical, certainly more than merely orgasmic. But they include our emotions and our spirituality and all of it. So in that sense, I'm kind of wondering if he did anything to even read the article. And I don't feel defensive about it, but I do feel disappointed that he didn't get anything at all out of it. However, I have noticed this with a lot of people, and not just incels, but there are a lot of people who have a certain resistance to change in their lives, because change, as all of us know, can be very frightening. And taking a look at oneself can be frightening, because if you read between the lines of Alone's writing, he tends to blame everyone and everything other than himself for what's going on in his life. So the repeated references to the sewer of my mind, the sewer that is our society, a lot of sewage. There's
mm-hmm. a lot of sewage in there.
A lot of filth in our society. And I'm dying to know more about what he thinks about that. So if you feel like writing again, please do. But I promise I'm not going to attack you or put you down, not even if we write one-on-one. And I do respond to people who write in with comments and questions like that. So it was just a little bit different. It had almost overtones of religion, where sex is dirty and sex is wrong, and you shouldn't even be thinking about that. And his mentioning the trauma of a young boy who's being pressured about having sex at an early age. I have to wonder if that's about him or some of his experiences where he just felt a lot of pressure. In any case, gosh, it's so exciting to actually have a real life troll. I mean, people are listening.
Yeah, that's cool. Or they're reading, because he was. I mean, maybe he'll see this and then he'll. I think it's a he too. I would imagine. And so
yeah, I'm pretty sure it's a guy.
But it seems like the main thing that he was upset about was the just the even suggesting that an incel is at risk of becoming a sex offender. But like you said, everybody is at risk of becoming a sex offender.
Every demographic that is identifiable that includes a sub-demographic of men who are not educated to manage their sexuality intelligently. And I say men, even though I know from professional experience, women can be arrested for sex crimes. In general, the vast majority of people arrested are going to be males. And so I see males, being at higher risk. And one of the early trainings I went to said that the typical profile of a sex offender was, now get this, listener, male, educated, and religious. And so, wow, wouldn't we want to be educated? And, for a lot of us, religion is considered a really good thing. But the speaker that day pointed out this particular group is under a lot of pressure to repress their sexuality in order to achieve success in their culture, religiously, and in their socioeconomic status. So with all of that repression, there's a vacuum created where I'm not thinking about sexuality, I'm not experimenting with sexuality, and I'm not learning about my sexuality. We're not discussing our sexuality because we're supposed to keep our eye on the prize, stay focused on success, or, from a religious perspective, focused on virtue, not on the things that are below, but the things that are above. And I've heard all the language, and I think most people listening have as well, but it also means what we're not paying attention to. Because part of being a normal adult human sexual being is having a normal adult sexual drive. And I want to include, with a nod to the asexuals out there, that even 0 is a number. And so if your perfect sex number, your magic sex number is a 0, that's okay too, as long as you know that and you're comfortable with that and you've made your peace with yourself. I think that's perfectly acceptable. That's less than 1% of the population, but for the 99% plus, there's usually some interest in sexuality and sexual pleasure, and learning to manage that really is what this program is all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one thing I was going to ask too, it's like he mentioned in the letter that not all incels are criminals, and almost all incels are not criminals. I mean, that's what he said.
There's so much truth to that. And it's a little bit like talking about any demographic that's at high risk. What we're talking about when we talk about risk is a critical mass of variables that make it harder and harder to make sound decisions. Mm-hmm. So if I were a parent who was going abroad and I had my young children to place with somebody because I couldn't take them due to whatever risk there was abroad, and I had 2 families I was considering, and they were perfectly equal in all ways, except one family was, let's say, an alcoholic family with mom and dad drinking too much. You don't have to have a PhD in psychology to think, yeah, that would not be the better family, because parents being alcoholic creates a sense of risk in terms of raising healthy children that it would be better if we could do without. All parents know that.
Yeah.
So we don't have to have studies to prove that. And it's the same way with physical abuse. If the 2 families were just alike socioeconomically, religiously, and both families were teetotalers, but one family believed in fairly aggressive physical corporal punishment for children when they misbehave, I think most of us would think, yeah, I want to put my kids with the other family. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about risk factors for sexual criminality, simply never having an outlet for one's sexuality that is healthy and involves genuine, meaningful connections with others, that's going to create a higher level of risk.
Yeah.
Certainly not a guarantee.
Yes.
It's not like every incel is going to end up as a sex offender, or every teenager is going to have sex, or everyone who listens to rock music is going to be following the devil. There's no. A lot of these are just irrational beliefs, but
it's like drinking and driving really quick. That's kind of what it reminds me of. It's like, it doesn't mean you're going to crash or
kill somebody
yourself, but
it creates a higher risk.
Higher at risk if you do.
Yeah, exactly. And the same with being sleepy and not being fully rested. Anything that would distract you, like having a lot of very talkative people making a lot of noise in the car, distracting you. There are all these things that set us up for failure. And I think for Mr. Alone, not being able to comfortably discuss sexuality or dating with his family, not being able to ask a woman out, even for a cup of coffee, just so he could get to know her better, I think that creates a heightened sense of risk for him and for any other man who is trying to grow up and have a great life.
Yeah. And I understand how people could be upset about it, like, because it's like when you're feeling upset or you feel like you've tried things, or it's like it's kind of like you become like a victim mentality. But it's like if you get stuck in that sort of way, you could kind of be more reactive and defensive towards things that you read.
Yeah, I do have more than 3 or 4 incels in my practice, and I've had many more than that over the years.
How many would you say that you've worked with?
Oh, probably 50. Okay. And they don't all self-identify as incels, but they fulfill the definition that he gave us of 6 months involuntarily without sex. A lot of these individuals are simply really struggling with not so much sexual issues, but social skill issues, where they just don't have the skills to ask someone out and to get to know people, even as friends. And then there's another whole group of really wonderful individuals who have autism and have a difficult time reading the room, reading relationships. And in that vein, I just have to recommend a series, actually 2 series, one in Australia, one from the United States, on Netflix called Love on the Spectrum, because you can see, if you watch the show, there's a very compassionate look at trying to help the autistic community and trying to understand the autistic community navigate what is obviously a very challenging part of normal everyday life for most of us. So, there's just a lot of reasons why people are celibate. Some of it is, I think I've shared the story of a client who's long ago deceased. He had a wife who, for one reason or another, after they had a few kids and 7 years of marriage, she announced she didn't want to have sex with him anymore. Yeah. But because of his religious beliefs, he stayed in the marriage. And because he was a really good person, he never had an affair. He never got a divorce. He never went to a brothel. And he just went into the bathroom and masturbated. And that was his sex life for the following 40 years after her announcement. And he eventually ended up discovering, because he was quite old, he discovered the new pornography coming out in the late 50s in the form of Playboy magazine. And then eventually, decades later, ended up downloading underage pornography off of the internet. And then the FBI came a-calling. So he was an incel, but certainly not by, I think not for the same reasons that other people would be incels. Yeah. So there's a lot of reasons why people end up being incels. And there are lots of potential remedies out there if one can find a therapist to work with who has some compassion, yes, some knowledge, and is also comfortable talking about sexuality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say too, like, going back to the 6 month thing, is that true? Where they say if it's the definition of an incel is someone who hasn't had sex in 6 months?
Well, I'm gonna, yeah, non-consensually, not unwillingly, where he's wanted to have a sex life. And I've never seen that particular definition. And I've never met anybody who only had a 6 month window like that. Because for me, as it went, before I married,
it's like I've been an incel multiple times in my life.
Right.
It's like
since you were 12, and because I think that's at a minimum for some people, and I trust alone to have the hard definition on that. But I've never met anybody who was in therapy who was having sex, who was not having sex for only 6 months, who then came in for therapy. Usually, in my experience, it's more like 10, 20, 30 years.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. And then why, I guess one question I'm thinking, there's a lot more to get to here, but why do people even want to identify as incels? Is that just because they're looking for a community or looking for a group? Why can't you just be like, well, I haven't been able to get a girlfriend? Why? Like, I feel like naming something, and I'm anti like almost all groups, so I'm not trying to pick on incels, but it's like, why would you want to be like, okay, well, now I'm going to identify as this group, and then doesn't the identification of that lead to a more kind of stuckness in that you're kind of identified with it? So
you're like an anarchist. You're like against society altogether.
But not altogether, but
I think people do feel comfort from joining a community, and there is comfort in that. I think where they get to feel supported, they get to share information. Oh, and how comforting is it to know it's not just me, it's there are other people who are in the same boat I am, whether it's a cancer survivor group or somebody like in the movie Fight Club, the testicular cancer group or the HIV group, whatever the group is. It's just really nice to be able to relax and to speak with people who get it, who understand what you're going through. The problem would be, as in some groups, where the group is reinforcing my psychopathology and my irrational beliefs, like joining a white supremacist group. That's more of a self-elected to victimhood kind of thing that, we poor white people just can't get a break. And it would be the same, I think, with incels, when really, it's so heartbreaking and so unnecessary for me, because clearly they want to connect, but they lack the skills and maybe have too many irrational beliefs and are unable to do that. And the reasons I've heard from them are, really quite sad. They'll say something like, well, no woman would ever want to be with a man who looked like me.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at a guy who's unremarkably average.
That's what you said to me one day. You're unremarkably average.
Did I really?
Yeah.
But neither thanks. Movie star good looking nor hideous as a troll could be. No reference to Mr. Alone. And I think that every guy you pass by in the street is unremarkably average. I don't think average is a terrible thing to be when it comes to the looks department.
Yeah.
My wife is more than good looking enough for the both of us to steal a line from Harry Potter. And I think that for these men, they tend to be very sexist and generalized about women, that I hear things like women are only into the 666 of a man who's 6 feet tall at a minimum, has a 6-pack and a 6-figure income.
No.
And that's not really true. And if there were women like that out there, and I'm sure there are, just like there are men in a corresponding group, they are not all representative of the entire gender.
Yeah. So no one like it. Who's going to be getting that? You wouldn't have a wife. I would never have a girlfriend. It's
right.
It's like, come on.
Yeah. So what we're all, I think, going to be far better served by is finding someone who's acceptably loving, and they can give love and receive love. They actually like us. Oh, and they are kind. because if they're loving and kind and we both are attracted to each other, I'm pretty close to being good to go. Now, there might be some other areas of, incompatibility and that sort of thing. And of course, that would include sexuality and sexual frequency and all that. Mm-hmm. But in the main, I think most of us forget that there are actually billions of kind people out there who really don't care what you look like. Or if they do care, they're going to be saying something ridiculous like my wife, poor thing, she's so in love. She'll look at me, an aging, bald, white guy, and yeah, but you're cute. And all of a sudden my defects become adorable in her eyes because she is obviously blinded by love.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about the, just getting emails like this or messages. Does it bother you at all from people when they do get upset with you? Because even when I get it, sometimes I'm like, oh man, what is this? Because it goes to me and then I go and then send it off to you or Sharon.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh man.
You're the filter.
Yeah. But I see it and I feel bad. I'm like, man, it's like, this sucks. It's like bad news that I'm delivering. And then
you can't be a good therapist and think at the same time that everything everyone says is somehow about you. So even if my client is saying, and I invite everybody to adopt this belief, that what we hear, and I learned this first in Al-Anon groups and adult children of alcoholics groups, that what I say and what I do is only and entirely about me. So even if I say, Jason, you're a big duty head, I mean, that's totally about me and my own incredibly juvenile sense of humor or my feeble hatred. But it's about me and my issues. Whereas, I think for me to read other people's stuff, knowing what I know about, it's not about me, it's about them. What comes across to me from Mr. Alone is just pain on top of pain on top of pain. But at the same time, I think what's hurting him so much is that he's not open to help for his pain because he's so discouraged from, his interactions with others. He feels misunderstood, he feels condemned, he feels criticized. And so for him, it has now become impossible to get help.
Well, I actually thought of the email as him reaching out, in a way, the message was not happy, but it was also he felt comfortable to at least write not only once, but twice.
Yeah. Knowing that we couldn't respond.
Yeah.
But at least he was trying to communicate. And so, yeah, I can take it in that sense too. Mm-hmm. Just because something is one thing doesn't mean it can't be additional things. Yeah. So I think it's both an expression asking for help and also a statement describing how utterly unamenable to getting help he is. Mm-hmm. And that's a real conundrum because it creates, I think, a lot of rage that I want help and no one is helping me. Well, but you're not taking responsibility for making it impossible for anybody to help you.
Yeah, that's true. And then he also mentions he called you a bigot and he said he doesn't want to go to therapy because of bigots. So it's like when you use harsh words and kind of a generalization of every therapist is going to be that. But you also said in the article that it is difficult for therapists to treat these clients and they do have a struggle. So it's like he's got some of this. He's got some truth there. It is difficult maybe for some of these people to get help, but it's not all therapists. That's why I think in the article you mentioned some questions to ask a therapist before you go and get treatment.
Yeah. And I meet wonderful therapists all the time. I'm very lucky in that way. But I also am aware that there are many therapists who really reflect the rest of our population as well, in the sense of being really uncomfortable with talking about sexuality. So that would be, I think, an unhelpful therapist at this time because, and again, I don't think it's about for Mr. Alone, I don't think it's about getting laid. I think it's about enjoying love in its fullness. So even being able to enjoy flirting, to enjoy getting to know someone, being able to ask them out and continue the pleasure of getting to know them. Long before there's any kind of sexual intimacy or sexual activity, I think there's a great deal of sexual pleasure that's available to people who are actively dating. He doesn't have any of that. And I think for a lot of therapists, they haven't broken that down, that whole mechanism of mate selection, into what is easily well over 100 different steps in terms of getting to know someone and getting closer to the point where it becomes safe and reasonable that they might have sexual intercourse.
Would you say that for somebody who is like this person or other people, what is something they could do to get out of this mindset? Like, is the first step is to start accepting some accountability for yourself?
I really wish this was the kind of podcast where there could be a helpful 1, 2, 3. And there just isn't. I'm sorry to say that out loud, but for the friends and family of these individuals, and for the people who identify as incels, or whether they identify it or not, when I encounter them and am working with them, it takes months and sometimes years for them to relax enough to even consider the possibility that they might open up themselves to getting to know someone. Even if I were to bring a sexual surrogate, somebody who's very safe, and just put a woman in the room, across the room from them, they have so much anxiety about that experience that they're not able to really relax and just be themselves. And I guess now that you've asked me the question, because we don't rehearse these podcasts or talk about them in advance, it occurs to me that the first goal for everybody, the incel and the person who is an incel but doesn't identify as that, the family and the friends, especially the male friends, I think we just want to encourage these individuals to be comfortable. Because out of feeling comfortable, we can begin to feel confident. And to be true friends with these individuals, I think is just wonderful, because then they can relax and they have so much to offer humanity, so much to give. I have incels who are autistic, but I also have incels who are incredibly artistically creative, incels who are at genius level, and they're all pretty wonderful. But they have really awkward social skills. So even if they have a mind like a very powerful computer, they get into a situation where there's a woman they're attracted to, and socially they really mess it up, even in a group setting. So getting to where they can relax and be comfortable, I think, is going to be well served. Step 2, by having friends of the same gender who they can just truly relax and sit around with and talk about these things, without the friend offering a lot of unhelpful, unsolicited advice, but just to be a friend, I think is absolutely important. And if you're trying to be helpful to these individuals, so it's a 2-step. I wish I could have that nice rounded 3-step thing, but I think at focusing on being comfortable and developing a circle of supportive friends, and I think after that, I think that would take literally years for the average incel just to, but it's a big get.
Yeah,
that's a wonderful thing in this very lonely society. Notice I didn't say sewer of a society, but it is a lonely society. By the way, I like our society a lot. So, and that whole sewer thing, it just kind of it's off-putting, isn't it? Because if it's so dirty, why would you want to connect with all these people? You wouldn't be an incel. You would be happily celibate, right? So.
Well, there are sewer areas within the society, but it's like if you focus on the negatives, then that's going to become your whole life. I mean, because there are stuff, this country, politics, it's like...
Well, sure. And you've got child sexual abuse in churches and in the Boy Scouts and in all these other venues. And it's just, there's always going to be horrible things going on around us. But our society as a whole, I think Western civilization is pretty amazing, and there's a lot to celebrate and to enjoy. So even if the person listening to this happens to be celibate, voluntarily or involuntarily, life isn't over by any means. I think for me, I had to. In fact, I would say, before I could ever happily be in a relationship, I need to learn how to be happy within myself. So I guess that would be step number 3, right?
Yeah.
Once you're comfortable, once you have a circle of friends, to develop a life worth living so that you could truly be happy, because only someone who's mentally ill would want to share the life of a miserable person. And happiness is its own reward. So if I'm truly living a happy life, the sunsets are still going to be beautiful. The gardens are going to be lovely. Music is going to be absolutely transcendent. I'm going to have all kinds of great literature to read, friends to have, and if you're really lucky, maybe a good dog to keep you company. But there's a lot to enjoy about life apart from romance and sex. So I would emphasize that for the celibate who's, kind of not doing so well in that other department for now.
Yeah. And I wanted to talk really quick about like friends and the friends being supportive. That's like, if you say, oh, I went on this date and it didn't work out, the friend isn't reinforcing that by being like, yeah, screw her, she was a whatever.
Yeah, right.
It's like you want friends to be like, oh, that's okay, she missed out on being with you. Because it's like you don't want to be. It seems like sometimes they bash the women for rejecting them.
Yeah, I hear a lot of that as well, from the misogynists who come to me for therapy, not realizing even that they're being misogynistic in their hatred of women as a class. And they're very easy, comfortable, generalizing and name calling with women. But there's something about men that I really do enjoy, in that in general, when I tell men, oh yeah, that's like clearly abusive, and I explain why it's abusive, most men, and I would say most men just go, yeah, you're right, that is abusive. It doesn't mean they'll stop.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean they're ready for change, but they at least acknowledge that it is abusive.
Okay.
That it's wrong. And sometimes they forget and they go back to it, or they don't embrace the abuse-free lifestyle as an ethos that I truly recommend to everyone. But it's I think it's pretty hard for any right-thinking woman to relax and get comfortable with a guy who's obviously misogynistic. I think that would be a sign of some real defective thinking on her part, right? Because it's just not safe.
Yeah.
It's only a matter of time before her name gets added to the list.
Yes. One of the lines that stood out to me in the second message was, your contribution to that sewage may have hurt some males for a lifetime.
Yeah,
like that kind of like summed up where the mindset is. Sorry, alone, if you're listening, but that's like such a, I mean, to
it's
say
unhelpful
in a kind way, like it's almost like I want to just like, it's such like a, I mean, it makes men feel so weak. It makes it be like, how are you going to let words of some guy who wrote an article like think that that's going to hurt you for life? It's like right. To me, I'm like, all right, dude, it's like, I get it. It sucks. I've been there before with some things in my life, but it's like, you can't, like, that mentality just seems like a very hard thing to break out of, and very defeating.
Well, for me, when I think of it from the point of view of therapy, it's hard not to go to talking about the irrational belief that this individual, Stephen Ing, whose name sounds like a verb, he somehow has this superpower to make people feel whatever he wants them to feel. Of course, that power is always exercised in the negative. I always make people feel horrible. But if I really had the power to make people feel whatever I wanted them to feel, I would be making Alone feel safe enough to contact us and get some help. Nobody has that power. And I think a simple thought experiment will demonstrate that. If anyone listening to this can imagine someone out there that you really love and care about. Maybe it's a grandchild or a friend from school. It could be anybody. And then imagine just trying as hard as you can you make yourself hate that person for, 100% of us, the answer is no. If I really love somebody, I can't make myself hate them. And if I am powerless over my own feelings, how can I possibly control the feelings of other people? That just makes no sense at all. Mm-hmm. So I don't doubt that he feels afraid that I might harm other people. I have no doubt that he feels insulted or that he feels angry, enraged, defensive, whatever it is he feels. But I think that is, again, entirely about him and his history and has nothing to do with me. And it's sort of an example, though, I think it's a good example of why any date he would go on would be fraught with all kinds of emotional landmines. Mm-hmm. Because if what I wrote has him feeling this enraged and hurt and fearful, then imagine if I had deliberately tried to insult incels, or if I had deliberately tried to castigate them as a demographic, mm-hmm. that they're all worthless. They need to be put on an island where they can just age and age out of the population and not be reproduced. Mm-hmm. So no, but I can't control anybody else's feelings, including that works both ways, right? He can't control my feelings, and I can't control the feelings of people listening to this. And and what's great about that is if I do feel hurt or angry or sad by what someone has said, I get to go ahead and become introspective, check out myself. What's going on? How did I come to feel those feelings? What are my beliefs? Is there anything wrong with those feelings? Do I, like if my dog dies, I'm going to be really sad, and I don't want a pill to take away my sadness. I don't need therapy to overcome my grief. So sometimes those feelings are quite healthy and wonderful, and we have no intention whatsoever of getting rid of them. And if that's his case, obviously therapy is not for him.
Yeah. You mentioned too, talking about how the notion of hurting incels and how self-defeating their righteous indignation is, not only with you, but with dating women in general, like how that's like a problem. It's kind of along the lines we've been talking.
Yeah, I think it's hard for the angry person, male or female, to understand this, I suppose. But if you're chronically angry or chronically and intermittently angry, you might want to ask yourself, what am I so afraid of? Because, whether it's somebody talking about sexuality or talking about sexuality more than I'm comfortable with, or it's somebody who's making vulgar jokes or whatever else it is, the fears that are potentially there are legion. And my amygdala, which at that little part of the brain, that's the base of the brain, just atop the spinal cord, about the size of a walnut, that part of my brain is 24/7 doing threat assessment. And so if I'm angry with a date, and he, I know he's, I'm imagining, at least, I don't know for sure, but I'm imagining that he's heterosexual. If he's feeling that threatened, the question to ask would be, well, what am I afraid of? Mm-hmm. And it could be, I'm afraid of change. I'm afraid of somebody wanting to talk about something very personal. I'm afraid of being judged. I'm afraid of that maybe I could be wrong, and that would threaten my identity because I'm never wrong. I'm always right. There's so many possible fears. Oh, even just the fear of being out of control. Speaking as a recovering control freak, the fear of being out of control is just awful unless you can embrace it. Mm-hmm. And once we become at peace with our fears, we have a lot more mastery over them. But the amygdala senses this threat, and we go right into fight or flight. And for those of us who are fleeing, leaving the room, getting out of the relationship, dropping out of school, isolating, staying in mom's basement for the rest of our lives, those isolating behaviors or fleeing behaviors are very, very effective. But for a lot of other personalities, and for different situations, becoming furious, rageful, and even vengeful, that feels very empowering. And I don't feel so afraid. But it's all fear-based.
Yeah.
The whole thing is fear-based.
And one thing I wanted to mention too, it's like to get letters like this, and from knowing you, it's like you do more work for this community of people than anyone that I've ever met. I mean, I'm sure there's other people who are doing it, but even like working with sex offenders, people who are incels, men who have gone astray, and rather than condemning them or calling them names or trying to say that they're horrible people, you essentially say it's not a moral thing. It's they just messed up in some way and they mismanaged their sexuality and how they're living, and you're empathetic towards that, and you kind of talk to these men. You have men's groups where you have circles and you write people who are in prison, and like you do all these things for men to help them.
You know the saying, no good deed goes unpunished. So I do think sometimes the people we're trying to help are very defensive and rather prickly. You know, they've got their force fields up and they are afraid, because there have been plenty of people out there in history who've, you know, in the name of I'm doing this for your own good, come in and try to be helpful when they're not really helpful at all. For me, I only claim to trying to be helpful, but I often have to just do a lot more listening than people might ever suspect, because I literally, and I accept the literal truth, I do not know everything about human sexuality. And 10 men may commit the same sexual act that is reprehensible, even in their own eyes, but for 10 different reasons. And so there's not a whole lot of generalizing that can be done in a situation like that. You really have to listen to people. And I really do care about these people. Once, you know, I haven't met an 11-year-old out there yet who decided that, you know, when I turned 11, I decided I wanted to grow up and become an incel, or I wanted to become a sex offender, or I wanted to grow up and have a horrible sexual life ahead of me, or a loveless existence for the rest of my life. Nobody wants that. We all would like to be happy. We would all like to be loved and be loving. And yeah, there are people who are incapable of that for a variety of reasons, like personality disorders among them. But nobody really wants that. Nobody chooses that. It's kind of just the way things are until they get the help that they need. And sadly, you know, we don't really see love itself as being the linchpin of mental health, but it is. You know, it's such a complex and challenging behavior to see what is lovable in a human being, to be able to express that those feelings of appreciation for that person. I'm just really glad I met you. I mean, you're just so courageous. You're really an inspiration to me. That's love. And to be able to let somebody else love me in return. Well, thank you so much. I mean, it really means a lot to me to hear your compliment. You're very kind for sharing it. Oh, you know, and at the risk of sounding like an episode of Chip and Dale, the two chipmunks who are, no, after you, by all means, after you. I want to just say we just forget how very important love is in our species. I mean, it's what takes us from being merely a species of people who can reproduce with each other to a eusocial species where we can build a complex organism that has so many interconnected parts. It's a thing of miraculous beauty. That's what civilizations are, the exercise of a eusocial species. And so I definitely want to help these people. And that's in my eusocial species environment, that's my little job. Whereas other people are building roads or raising the food that we all eat or having babies and caring for children. This is sort of my specialty. And I'm like everybody else who loves their career. I love mine. And I really do invite Mr. Alone and all the Mr. Alones who would be listening to this to consider trying to get comfortable within yourself, trying to find a circle of friends of the same gender, and then trying to maybe go forward and have a great life worth living.
Great. I think that's a good place to end with that. And just really quick though, I did want to ask. So you see yourself as you're generating love and putting love out. I mean, that's what we're doing with this podcast, managing love intelligently. You're helping people understand it, see it, and then go have it for their lives and spreading out. You're like an old hippie.
I am like an old hippie, and I'm a bit of an old hippie, but I'm also the guy who's a very typical guy with all the other elements of my personality intact. My Aunt Bonnie is visiting right now this weekend, and she clued me onto a book series with calendars and playing cards and everything. And don't look at it if you're easily offended by 4-letter words, but it's called Effin' Birds. And it is hysterical. And there's that part of me, even in a men's group where people are crying, there's this part of me that wants to pull some lines out of that very vulgar milieu and just set people to laughing. And sometimes I do. I give in to that impulse, and it's okay. And sometimes I am able to successfully resist and repress, and things go a lot better. But I do believe that across our society, we incredibly undervalue the importance of love. And one of the ways, for example, that would help budding incels and all the other boys in the class in an elementary school would be if teachers could just make a note and write it in the report card or talk to the parents about this at a parent-teacher conference. I noticed Billy doesn't seem to have any friends. He's very lonely, because it would be a whole lot easier to do an intervention for a young boy and start teaching him remedial social skills or encouraging some children to reach out to him and be friends. It'd be so much easier than letting that just go on 20 or 30 years and then being shocked at the misery and suffering of this adult human being. Yeah. So if you're a teacher or a parent out there, maybe to talk to one another and see if you could get some of that going too.
Cool. All right, great. Well, thanks, Steve, and thank you Alone for the messages. Hopefully you listen and it's helpful for you. All right, here we're going to go. We're going to wrap up with a listener question, and if you have a question for Steve, visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. So this week's question is, Dear Dr. Ing, I am married to a 76-year-old man with ADHD that was not diagnosed until he was in his 50s. As a non-ADHD spouse, I often find it frustrating in regards to his attention span, lack of focus, and disorganization. What can I do to manage these aspects so that there's harmony in the home and he doesn't drive me out of my effing mind? It challenges my patience.
Did you clean up the language there?
I did.
Mind? Okay. So, this is a time where I would probably be a little humorous. If you could get out of the house more often, I think you'll feel better. The other thing for me, I have a son with ADHD, and a beloved son, and it drove me crazy when I thought it was all deliberate or intentional or personally directed at me. His forgetfulness, his inattentiveness, his procrastination, his failure to follow through and complete projects, like just simply raking the leaves in the front yard. But once I realized that it was ADHD, it was like working with people who have sex crimes, realizing, no, none of us are really doing what we're doing because we're evil or because we just really want to hurt somebody. Almost every single time, it has a very easily understandable explanation. It's just that so many of us are so ignorant, we don't know what it is. And I was one of those ignorant people when it came to ADHD and my son. And I was thinking always, every day, he needs more discipline. He needs more discipline. I have to be tougher. And there was no way I was ever going to punish him out of his ADHD. In the same way, just accepting that this is really not something he's going to do anything about, especially if he's in his mid 70s. It's hardly likely that now, 20 years deep into his diagnosis, now he's going to find the right medication or develop the coping strategies to deal with it. Maybe we could just give thanks for all the wonderful qualities he does have that have kept you married to him all these years, and minimize the rest by accepting them as rather quirky characteristics of his ADHD brain, which is not neurotypical, and speaking as a neurotypical to what I presume is a neurotypical, to understand that we neurotypicals have our rather annoying traits, including on my part. I can be very, very boring. And I think people with ADHD are not. So if we can just, take a look at maybe his character, give thanks for what I presume is a loving relationship where he's really crazy about his partner, and then to get out of the house as often as you can, and maybe even hire a housekeeper to pick up some of the debris that is left in his wake.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Steve. Thank you for listener question, and thank you all for listening, and we will see you all next time.